Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al-Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to the Al-Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. U.S. President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran on Monday evening. The announcement came just hours after Iran struck the U.S.'s Al-Udeid military base in Qatar, and around 48 hours after the American strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. Israel and Iran both quickly accused each other of violating the ceasefire with strikes overnight, prompting Trump to publicly criticize the two countries Tuesday morning Washington time. The ceasefire has since appeared to hold, but there are questions about how it will be enforced and if the wider conflict can be resolved with U.S.-Iran nuclear talks on hold. My guest this episode is Al-Monitor's Pentagon correspondent, Jared Szuba. Jared takes us through the challenges upholding the Israel-Iran ceasefire faces, as well as the latest information on the damage resulting from both the U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities and the Iranian strike on the base in Qatar. Hope you enjoy. Jared, welcome back to the Al-Monitor Brief.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on this busy news day. Jared, how does the U.S. military leadership view this ceasefire agreement between Israel and Iran?
Well, I don't want to speak, directly for U.S. military leadership on the ceasefire, but I think it's pretty widely understood among U.S. military officials that totally destabilizing the Iranian regime is not an option that is in U.S. interests. President Trump seemed to indicate that today, speaking to reporters, that regime change is not the objective. And if we want to understand sort of the purpose and the intent of the ceasefire and the trajectory of it, it's worth asking what the president's objectives are, not only with the ceasefire, but with about, tacit green lighting of Israel launching this war, and of course about the U.S. strategic bombing operation that we saw over this past weekend. There are military objectives to that, which are clearly stated, but the results are unconfirmed. And then there are likely political objectives, which are not as clear and publicly articulated. But on the ceasefire, there's a real question as to whether or not it's going to hold. We know very little, if anything, about any sort of enforcement mechanism. What is Israel's freedom of action? Should the Iranians not abide, or vice versa? What happens, if the intent of the ceasefire and the pressure campaign from Washington was to get the Iranians back to the negotiating table? What happens if the Iranians come to the negotiating table but don't budge on their stated red lines of domestic enrichment? Do you have a situation in which, the White House gives another green light for the Israelis to continue the air campaign? You run the risk of potentially heading towards a situation resembling that like you see in South Lebanon or perhaps in Iraq post-1991, in which, in those cases, you had the sort of outside forces had the capability to strike at will. If that's going to be the case, if Iran is simply going to be a shooting gallery for Israeli warplanes, whatever things aren't going in the way which Israeli leadership wants them to, or perhaps President Trump in Washington, that's very likely to push the Iranian leadership towards resuming or restarting a covert nuclear weapons program.
And stepping back a little, you mentioned the U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. What do we know about the damage that the U.S. did to those facilities in those attacks over the weekend?
Yeah, it's a great question. We actually know very little publicly. The Secretary of Defense and President Trump have been quite adamant in their public comments about damage that was inflicted at the three sites at Fordow, Esfahan, and Natanz. The Pentagon's top general, who's also the president's top military advisor, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, was a bit more reserved earlier this week in his remarks, but he did echo political leadership in their confidence in the damage that was inflicted. He said, quote, that all three sites sustained extremely severe damage and destruction. It's worth noting that, that is not necessarily evident just yet to outside observers, given that most of these facilities, particularly at Fordow, are subterranean, and there's no U.S. boots on the ground and no international inspectors in the country at the time. So the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, mentioned that the damage is, likely extensive, but can't be reliably discerned until inspectors are on the ground in Iran. And just in the last hour, we've seen CNN report that initial intelligence assessments from the United States indicate that perhaps the core components of the Iranian nuclear program, centrifuges, advanced centrifuges, and highly enriched uranium have not been destroyed. So the question then is, if that's the case, what happens next? Again, it brings us back to the question of the ceasefire. What are the rules? What are the next steps? Is this a scenario in which the Israelis can continue to strike at will and the United States joins them under certain circumstances? Again, as I mentioned, that's a scenario that is likely to put the Iranian regime even further on the ropes. And many analysts have pointed out that that is a scenario, or doing so is one way in which the Iranian government may very well feel encouraged to pursue pursuit of a nuclear weapon using the remnants of whatever hasn't been destroyed. I can think you can very easily see a scenario in which the Iranian government comes back to the table and says, "Well, look, we lost track of all the uranium. You guys bombed it. We don't know where it went." But Iran is a vast country with plenty of hiding places, and there's no reason to think there's no concrete evidence available publicly at this time that it was certainly that it was all destroyed, let alone most of it.
And on the converse, this Israel-Iran ceasefire obviously came just hours after the Iranian attack on the Al-Udeid air base in Qatar. What do we know about the damage Iran did or didn't do to that attack on the U.S. base?
Yeah, well, so far what we're hearing is that there really hasn't been any damage. President and U.S. Central Command have said the attack was successfully thwarted. I believe the president posted on Truth Social that there were 14 Iranian ballistic missiles that were launched at Al-Udeid in Qatar. And then 13 of them were intercepted. The Qatari government took credit for its military intercepting them, and then the president said, the U.S. intercepted them, and then CENTCOM later came out with a statement crediting both the U.S. and the Qataris for a coordinated, partnered air defense that was successful. No mention was made in the CENTCOM statement or the others that the U.S., of course, had early warning ahead of the Iranian strike through Qatari intermediaries. The Iranians gave an indication ahead of time that the attack was coming. And of course, as we and many other outlets reported late as early as last week, that the typical U.S. footprint troop presence at Al-Udeid is much curtailed at this moment. We don't have specific numbers at this time, but a lot of folks, not only at Al-Udeid, but many other bases in the region, U.S. military personnel have been moved to other areas or dispersed as a precaution ahead of anticipated Iranian retaliation. The interesting point that I think was worth noticing immediately after the Al-Udeid attack was, President Trump obviously seized upon it as a sort of one and done. That's it. Let's bring peace and get the Iranians back to the table. But it was the Iranians were also subtly signaling that as well. I think it's worth noting the IRGC statement on the attack quoted a verse from the Quran in which was clearly indicating that they were seeking proportional retaliation rather than escalation with the United States. So it's clear that the United States seized upon that, and in this sort of choreographed, symbolic, but nonetheless, potentially deadly barrage, you had an off-ramp built in for both sides.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with Jared Szuba after this short break.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
Okay, we're back. Jared, looking forward, is the Israel-Iran conflict over, at least for the time being? And what's next for the wider conflict in the region?
Yeah, I mean, I think this fragile is an understatement for this ceasefire. Like I said earlier, we don't have any clarity on what sort of mechanisms enforcement are in place or will be in place. The big question is, who's, if you look at the situation in Lebanon that was negotiated during the prior administration, U.S. administration, you have the U.S. as the mediator and the overseer of a ceasefire enforcement mechanism, but the enforcer of the ceasefire is one of the parties to the ceasefire, Israel. Is that going to be the case now? And already within the first hours of the ceasefire, you saw Israel taking action, which its leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu, said was in response to an Iranian violation of the ceasefire. So, which party is going to step in when that occurs again, if it occurs again, which I think is very likely. So, it seems to be that the president has taken to Twitter and phone calls with Prime Minister Netanyahu to try to intervene today. But is this something that the president is personally going to oversee and manage and intervene in every single time things get a bit shaky? I think that's difficult to imagine. So I think it's fair to say that this conflict is very much likely not over, and there are more questions than answers at this time as to where to go from here. It's absolutely fair to say, I think, that this is a major turning point in the conflict, the confrontation, decades-long confrontation between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other, and its proxies. But the way this is handled, the way this is managed diplomatically with the Iranians and their willingness to engage and make concessions very well could determine the future relations of Iran with not only the United States and Israel, but with the West. What I think a lot of folks and policymakers in Washington do not want to see is Iran become another sort of North Korea, in which it sees nuclear weapons as the only key to its regime survival, and it sort of goes underground. You know, Khamenei takes the card from Nasrallah's playbook and goes underground. He already is now, but one can foresee a situation that would not be productive for either side going forward.
Jared, thanks a lot for your time, and we look forward to more of your reporting.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks for listening to the Al-Monitor Brief. Be sure to follow Al-Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.